Welcome into the Thunder Basketball universe presented by Coop Ale Works. We've talked to you all season long about Thunder Basketball. Even in the past few weeks after the season has ended, we have been all about Thunder Basketball, which makes sense because this is the Thunder Basketball universe. But today, we're doing something a little bit different, and we're diving into some very interesting but very important history about this beautiful game that we cover called basketball.
Yeah, we had the chance to talk to Claude Johnson, the author of the book, The Black Fives. We actually had a chance to get an early copy of the book before it was even released, talk to him before the book came out. And this is the story of Black basketball in America prior to the NBA. Yes. And I just think, we both had the chance to dive into this, learn some of these personalities, these kind of larger than life figures when you really pull back and untangle their stories, their family stories, all of the things that happened, the ways that they persevered, some of the lucky circumstances that all came together to put them into position to be these pioneers of the game for Black people in this country. And so we got to talk to Claude about that too.
Yes. So much interesting information and history in this book. Information and history I didn't know about, having played the sport my entire life. Just really, really eye-opening. Once again, the book is called The Black Fives, The Forgotten Era, the epic story of basketball's forgotten era. And if you flip to the back of the book, you might notice a familiar name, and that's because Sam Presti gave this book some advanced praise, and that is printed on the back of this book. So we had a chance to talk to Claude about his book, his background, and his connection with the Thunder in this interview. Let's listen in. We are now joined by the author of The Black Fives himself, Claude Johnson. Claude, first of all, thank you so much for being on our podcast, being willing to talk to us about your new book. And then second of all, I have to give you a massive congratulations because I know this book was probably no easy undertaking, and I'm holding it in my hands right now. It is soon to be released on May 24th, and just a big congratulations to you on this accomplishment.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on the show with both of you and with the Thunder, and just affiliated on the program. And I couldn't be more pleased, with the completion of the book, but also that you're interested and excited about it. And I'm eager to tell you more.
Yeah. So just for context, Thunder general manager Sam Presti wrote advanced praise. It's on the back of the book jacket here. So, maybe can you just first off, tell us about your connection to the Thunder, and this probably leads into why we heard about you as well.
Yeah, so several years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I got a call from Sam's office, and he had found out about the work we were doing with the Black Fives Foundation, which is a nonprofit that I run, that I've founded. Our mission is to research, preserve, showcase, teach, and honor the history of the pre-NBA history of African Americans in basketball. And so we talked, and he said, we really got to get you in here. I don't know yet what this is going to result in or do or how exactly, but come on in, we'll have a conversation. So I came in, and then I came back for a presentation to the staff as well as to the team. And what was cool about it is, they had a mandatory Black Fives meeting for players. It was right after practice, and it was beautiful because that was the first time really that an NBA team had brought me in and brought us in to discuss this history with players. It's one thing to do it as a community relations effort or to have an interview, but it's another thing to do the face-to-face. And the reaction and response was amazing because this was when Russell Westbrook was there, Steven Adams, Paul George and others. And so it was a couple of years ago, but still like the embrace of this history and the way that the Thunder staged and presented it was incredible. And then, we went to dinner, and as we were talking, Sam and I discovered that we both went to the same high school in Massachusetts, Concord Carlisle High School, a couple of years apart, but shared some common ground in terms of our experiences there. And Sam has set up a nonprofit, a grant for African American student athletes in the Boston area that are connected with Concord Carlisle. So So we just had a really good connection, and so when the book, as we were getting ready to publish, the publisher says, okay, who do you want as your blurbs? And I just thought, what about Sam? Because this history resonated with him, and he was so passionate about bringing it forward, not just with the Thunder, but with the league. And so I'm just delighted that his blurb is on there. They call it a blurb on the back of the book cover, because I think it lends validity and just a stamp of approval somehow, and maybe there's just a way to that others will see that as well.
Well, there's no wonder why there's such high praise in these blurbs on the back of the book, and why there's been such a great reaction from, the talks that you've been able to give and when you came to the Thunder, and why that's so memorable, because this is really important and also really fascinating history that somehow isn't widely known around the United States. And so I was curious and wanted to ask you how you became interested in this topic and why you became so passionate enough to start a foundation and write a book about it.
Well, it started out, I used to work at the league office. I was the director of international licensing in 1996 when the league was celebrating its 50th anniversary, or what they felt was the 50th anniversary at the time. And, there was a little bit of history that was done and some research, and they came out with an 800-page book called the NBA Encyclopedia of Basketball. And in that book, there were only 3 pages devoted to earlier African-American teams, and it was just 2 teams. It was the Harlem Globetrotters and this squad called the New York Renaissance, or the Wrens. And but I knew that there were dozens of more teams, African-American teams, because Arthur Ashe, the tennis legend, had written this book called A Hard Road to Glory. And in that book, he listed several teams, and that began my journey of, okay, wait, how did he find out about these teams? How does one do research? How do you write? And so I started digging into it, and nobody knew anything about it. The Hall of Fame didn't know. The league, archivists and historians didn't know. And so, that began a journey where I would just go to the library in the basement of the Schomburg in Harlem, Schomburg Library, which is part of the New York Public Library system, and go through the microfilm. And then as I was going through the microfilm, I realized, wow, there's like dozens of teams. And starting from about 1904, they were chronicled in all of the early, vintage African-American newspapers. And that's when I started writing the facts down, and on my part-time and weekends, vacation time, whatever, I was down in that library scrolling through microfilm. That was before this was all digitized, and so that's how the journey started. And I did a lot of this writing really like 20 years ago, and then had to put it on the shelf because of raising a family and having a other corporate career. I left the NBA to go to Nike, and then I worked for Fat Licensing, which was Fat Farm, for a while, and Benetton Sports Systems and some other things. And then eventually these last 3 or 4 years, got a book deal with Abrams Press, and that was a long time in the making. Not so much with them, but just the idea that you could even have a book deal. Because at the very beginning, I didn't really know how to write. I knew how to create sentences and put information down, but to put that into a story or a series of stories or connect it all together is something that I had to learn over the years. And so it's really gratifying that this is out there now.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the writing process since you brought it up. It's clear that you sort of fell in love with a handful of these real life human beings that you tracked down as you went about your research. And it just seems like as you continue to unravel, their lives and learn more about them, they all started to kind of crisscross with each other, with events in American history, with, prominent figures in American history that people would maybe consider more like household names. What was that like for you as you sort of started to, it's clear you have an affection, such a deep affection for some of these people, these souls that you came across.
Yeah, I mean, it probably goes back to when I was a kid. My mom and dad would take us to Chicago, to the south side of Chicago, because that's where my dad's family was from, and that's how I got to meet and learn about his mom and dad, who's my grandparents, and their brothers and sisters, who were all like by that time like in their 80s, and so they would talk about how they migrated from Louisiana and sharecropping back then. And I just got this sense that there were these elders in our community, in our lives, that maybe we don't even know their whole stories, right? And then as I started learning about this, I started thinking, well, were they part of this somehow, or indirectly, or what's going on? Because a lot of this history does go back to Chicago, not all of it, but you pointed out, and correctly, that it's really, instead of one big story, it's really the stories of people and what they were thinking, and why they made the decisions they made, and how they eventually all connected and intersected, ultimately to when the NBA became racially integrated in 1950 and then beyond, right? But so that was like one connection. And when a person once asked me, Claude, what's your birthright to this? And I said, well, I think it's just something in me that says, giving voice to the voiceless, right? Because I got that sense from my grandparents and their siblings, in terms of what they left behind, and that nobody even talked about it. And so these pioneers are the same. They did all these amazing accomplishments and contributions, but who's talking about it? And so that just means they're silenced. And I just felt like, instead of talking about a team and their exploits, which is great, let me see if I can get into the people behind that team and humanize it. And so, that was also a trek and a journey for me, an evolution for me, because and as a blogger, let's say, you're just talking about facts, like, hey, and then in 1950 this happened, and in 1922 this happened, and they won, and the next night they lost, and then but it doesn't really, there's nothing behind it that makes you appreciate that fact. And so that's what I learned along the way. And it takes a long time to get your voice, and just to try to understand, like, what is it that people really want to hear from you. They don't just want to hear the facts, they want to hear what you think about the facts, right? Or what, so there's sort of like all these things that are going on in this book, which I'm really excited about it. And also, it's cathartic because you get it out of your system,
Yeah, let's talk about some of those people, because when you think about kind of the history of African-American basketball specifically, some of the big names come to mind: the Harlem Globetrotters, and if you're really savvy, maybe the New York Wrens, if you know your trivia. But there were plenty of people that we have to thank for the pioneering of African-American basketball. You point them out, you go through their whole life in this book. Talk about how you were able to discover these pioneers and what you learned about them along the way.
Well, so I just tried to go back to, along the way, I discovered this individual named William Anthony Madden, Will Madden. And, I was just intrigued by his name also, because Will Madden, like, right, that just tells you, like, all about him in a way, right? Like, wait, why does this guy have a name like that, And so, and then I realized, okay, wait, this individual was born at the time that the Brooklyn Bridge opened up in 1883. And he died after Nike was founded, and Puma and all those companies, in the early 70s. And yet, then I started looking around, like, whatever happened to him? And I discovered through the records of the municipal archives in New York City that he had died without any heirs, without any known next of kin, nobody in his family. So nobody came to his funeral or anything. He was just buried, and he's in an unmarked grave. And so I always thought, like, how is it that this guy was the king of black basketball, He was the top headline maker nationally in the black press and even in the white press. But he has an unmarked. He's buried in an unmarked grave. And I used to think, okay, well, for today's athletes, do you realize that as many headlines as you're making, what if that same fate happens to you? Like, what's your legacy? What are you trying to really leave behind, right? And like, let's hope that doesn't happen. The times are different, but also I also wanted to explore the individual too. Like, how did that happen to one person, but yet another individual like Cumberland Posey is buried in, a prominent graveyard with lots of markers and his whole family around him. And, so I wanted to look at that too. And then I kind of felt like this history was buried in an unmarked grave also. Mm. And so that kind of was the driving force behind looking at not just Will Madden, but other, pioneers as well. Like, okay, they were born, they died, or they did this, they did that, but how did they get there? What was the background? What did their parents do? What was the context in which they made these decisions? And, hopefully that, like, the way I look at it is I'm putting you with this book on a basketball train, mm-hmm. But if you look out the windows, there's history going by, right? So we have a chance to look at the landscape and the scenery that's going by, but still stay focused on, the basketball history part of it.
One of the things that's so fascinating to me as you're talking about that is with each of the characters, and as we go by on that train, you're seeing massive events like the New York draft riots that are happening around the same time that these, people are, coming into their age. There are other more systemic issues that they're dealing with in terms of, public school funding and all that kind of stuff. And yet, these pioneers sort of persevered through all of those obstacles and found time, as you point out that, at that time, Booker T. Washington was really at the forefront of trying to encourage this physical activity and to find ways to better just the physical health of the Black, community in the United States. Yet they, these people were navigating through all of these barriers, both structural, physical, and then like maybe more systemic and pervasive and sinister. And yet they still found time to achieve great success in this leisure sport activity,
Well, the thing is, Nick, it was, at the time, it was not leisure. It was for survival.
Yeah.
It was because this was a way not only of inspiring the community and inspiring that fitness, because remember, at a certain point in time, there was no such thing as physical fitness. That was a concept that evolved over time. Right. And even at the time, fitness, or what they used to call physical culture, some people called it muscular Christianity. Those concepts that came out of the YMCA primarily were to help young men, especially, avoid moral decay. Because if you didn't give them something to do in the winter months or whatever, then they would just go towards vice and gambling and drugs and alcohol, saloons, and then they would just go downhill. It was like a path to the penitentiary is what they would call it, right? And this was especially true also in the African American community, where there were even less opportunities and less access to healthcare and to any kind of community building. So the church was heavily involved, and social groups were heavily involved. So at the beginning of this, it was really to help organize around that effort. So that's why at the very beginning, so many of the teams were connected with amateurism. Mm-hmm. And so, churches, social clubs, athletic clubs, YMCAs, and so on. But as it evolved, then it became, again, like just not only a business, but also a way of because any milestone or achievement in the Black community was seen as and embraced as progress for the race, the whole race. So to have a team go around and barnstorm wasn't just that they were out there making money, sharing the gate receipts in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. It was that they were promoting like the excellence of the race itself. And in many cases, this was the first time that somebody in Oshkosh or wherever it was even seeing Black people in a positive light, right? So they were really ambassadors in a far greater way. It definitely, I mean, yes, today it's a leisure sport, but back then it had a great significance in terms of community health, wellness, well-being. You know, now we're going back to self-care, but you know, back then it was self-care for the entire race. It had to do with, okay, wait, what's going on and what do we need? What is the imagery we need? What are people gravitating towards?
Claude, this was probably one of the most interesting parts of the book for me, was seeing the history of where and why basketball started, right? It was for fitness and wellness, like you're saying, and then the evolution of that. And I'm obviously thinking from today's perspective, when we have the NBA and the lights and the flash and the glamour and the entertainment factor of it. But especially when the incorporation of like dance halls and basketball, that whole thing was really, really interesting to me, because it started to make a connection in my mind. And I want to get your perspective on this, on the connection between culture, society, and sport. And that's something that obviously we see today just with, you know, player walk-ins and fashion and how that permeates throughout the entire communities and the entire nation. But back then it was a little bit different, but still there. And I just want to get your perspective on how that interplay has kind of evolved and transformed kind of throughout the decades.
Yeah, so at first I thought you were going to say, you know, there was a left guard and a right guard and a left forward and a right forward, right? So I know you were point guard.
I was a point guard.
Were you, Paris, were you left guard or were you right guard?
I feel like I was right-handed, so I probably would have been on the right side of the floor, you know.
Is that funny? That was one of the more humorous things about this history that I like.
They couldn't contain Paris to just one side of the floor.
That's it. Yeah. No, I mean, but to answer your question, I mean, so just turns out that right around 1910, when the phonograph and radio became commercially available, that's when people started discovering that there was this African-American new musical art form called ragtime. And prior to this, people like Scott Joplin, their music was only available as sheet music, and you could play it on a piano in your parlor or even on a player piano in a saloon or something like that. But people didn't really know whether it was a Black artist or not. They just knew it was sheet music. But after the phonograph came out and radio, people realized, okay, wait a minute, this music is amazing, but you couldn't necessarily afford a piano, right? So you would want to go out and see that performer live. And at the time that this happened, these earlier Black artists who previously were kind of in the background now suddenly had a stage and popularity where people wanted to see them. And so the ballrooms where they played, often on off nights, were empty. And at the same time, Black basketball managers and promoters were looking for venues to play. So they just put two and two together and said, wait a minute, here's an empty ballroom. Here's a band that's trying to get popularity and grow. And here's a team. Let's mash that all together, right? Like Reese's, you know, and just, you know, that ad they have, and just be like, okay, here we have music, we have sport, and then we have all these people coming together for the dance part, because they would have music before the game, during halftime, and after the game, they would be dancing. And this social part was an opportunity for all the people from North Carolina that couldn't in any way like connect with one another to meet up, because they didn't have phones or social media or Facebook or IG or Snapchat. So this was the first time that actually social networking could take place, because it was a chance for people. So say there was a team from Washington, D.C. coming up to play a team in Brooklyn. that's the first time that Black folks in Brooklyn had a chance to even kind of get to know, like, what's happening in DC? What do you all hear? Oh, really? What's going on in Brooklyn? Oh, what about New York City? Oh, yeah. And so, hey, how's Aunt Hattie? Whatever. Like just like finding out ways to connect and catch up afterward. And so these became meaningful social events, as well as just ways to keep enhancing the marketing part, because all these ads started saying, they all said basketball and dance. It wasn't just basketball game, it was basketball and dance. And by the way, basketball was 2 words back then.
Yeah.
A basket and a ball.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Claude, what you're describing is just sort of the bottom up way that the basketball culture changed, kind of in those 50 years between, the first Black players playing to the time that the NBA started to integrate. And, we still see sort of that bottom up way that the game evolved and changed. You think about, the 3-point revolution was more of just this thing that bubbled up from below, as opposed to was, this top down phenomenon. So I guess I'm just curious because, I think that maybe to some folks, there's this simplistic view, basketball was invented by James Naismith in the late 1800s, then the NBA starts, and so what were some of the things that you noticed in your research about how the game evolved and how specifically these Black players that you track, how they helped the game evolve over the course of those decades?
Yeah, well, the rules were different at the beginning, right? So at one point you had a rule where if the ball went out of bounds, then the first player that got to it, or the team that got to it first, they retained possession. So you had, 10 or 5 players jumping into the stand, into the out of bounds area to get the ball. So they realized, okay, this is probably not safe. So then that's why they had a cage. They put a cage around the court. That's why a lot of, even today, some old school journalists will refer to basketball players as cagers. But that's what that was from. And then, and then there were some other rules, like the differing rules between the AAU and collegiate, where if you had already dribbled, you couldn't shoot the ball. And then in the other case, if you dribbled and caught the ball with 2 hands, you could still keep dribbling, catch the ball with 2 hands, keep dribbling, catch the ball with 2 hands, back in, keep dribbling, and then turn around and, go for the layup or whatever. The fact that those rules were in place meant that you could be just this bruising type of, team, and sometimes they could be steel workers or farm community or whatever the case. I mean, the finesse wasn't really part of it, right? But when they changed the rules, then suddenly you had to, speed and movement without the ball became a factor and really mattered. You could really beat a team that was much bigger and sturdier with speed and finesse. And so, in the Black community, that started to become a thing. So if you read about Cumberland Posey, for example, they started talking about shooting from half court and from long distance range. And it became so effective that that's how they warmed up. They would warm up before a game by making half court shots. And it was just mind blowing and also unnerving to the opposing team, because they were just like, oh my God, what's about to happen to us? And it was all part of the show, but it was also the way that they, finessed those rules. And I think that helped lead to the motion offense, which was bewildering to opponents that hadn't seen that before, or just constant movement, which is now just an intrinsic part of most basketball offensive sets. And then, all the plays that come off of that. And so that was an innovation. And then just using speed and leaping ability. In the earliest part of this game, you had to have a center jump ball after each made field goal. So you could technically, if you had a player with great leaping ability, even if they weren't the tallest player, the center was really pivotal, literally, because if you got possession of the ball after that made field goal, then you could score and just you could literally almost shut out a team, but they would never get possession. And so that became important. And then just all of the ways that they became innovative with the ball handling and the athleticism that was needed. Because again, you didn't want to. There were fights that happened, and a great amount of resistance too, right, to these teams coming out. But here's the thing. Here's where that sort of is so amazing. Also, you have a team like the All Black New York Renaissance, and they're going out to, let's say, Wisconsin, which technically in a certain way was an all-white state, and then Oshkosh is an all-white town, and other places like that. And they're getting invited there, and they're coming into town, and they're beating that team, leaving, and then getting invited back. And it's because there was they're almost like a mobile, economic stimulus, because merchants and hotels and bars and restaurants, people come from miles around because there was nothing else to do. So this was like a really good economic business opportunity, and then as an entertainment opportunity. These people, it was in the middle of the Great Depression, the middle of Jim Crow also. So you have to ask, how did this happen? Well, they had to shake hands and collaborate, right? And at the same time, people were like, hey, let's go see that team, because there were no movies, they didn't have drive-ins, they didn't have much else. So this was a really important, again, way to get the community out. And so, to do, but some of the stories that came out of that in talking to or watching the oral histories of the Rens players is that, their traveling secretary had to carry a loaded revolver with him in his pocket when they did the head count to make sure they got paid at the end of the game, or in case they had to escape for some reason, because sometimes it resulted in a brawl. And then, they literally would say we had to break jaws to gain respect. Like we had to they had 3 or 4 players that were just really good at knocking somebody out. And they had to do that to get respect. And then after a while, all these teams along the barnstorming circuit would realize, okay, they're all right. They're okay. Like, we respect them. We may not win. They may win sometimes. Maybe sometimes we win. But that part is now no longer part of the game, because we can't. That's not relevant anymore, right? And so that's the hidden part of this history, is that so much of this happened, but also that's why they were pioneering, not just because the way they played, but also how they were able to overcome and then keep getting invited back also.
Yeah, and this is the last thing we want to ask you, basically, before we let you go, because you're kind of leading into it. But obviously, this history is so important to. And I feel kind of slighted that I didn't know about this growing up playing basketball. Right, knowing the pioneers and the history and the legends of the game that allowed people like that look like me to be able to play the game as well. And so I'm curious why this has been so important for you to bring this history to light, and what you've noticed about people who learn about the history for the first time when you go and have talks and present to teams like you did with the Thunder, what the reaction has been, what you've learned in terms of why it's important to get this out there.
So I have 3 sons, and they're all scholar athletes. And so this has been part of our upbringing, and their upbringing all their lives. And it's important because they see that just because we have this today, we have the great facility and the ice baths and everything, right? Like that people have, like, it doesn't mean that this always was the way that it was. There was a fight just to get from pure amateur to professionalism in basketball, right? Especially for Black players. So none of that should be taken for granted. And some of the reaction is, like, on the one hand, people are like, they're really mad. Like, how come I didn't know this? Like what you said. We should know this. Did somebody keep this from us? Like, is this a conspiracy? Like, what is this? Right. And then on the other hand, it's like, oh, this is why. Like, it just naturally went into the background because of the advent of the NCAA and the NBA. And there was no reason yet, in the majors, there were quite a few players from the Negro leagues who came in, but in the NBA that didn't happen. So so that's part of the reaction, and I think it's just because we owe that debt of teaching this history, the education to today's players, for an appreciation, but also for our trademark slogan is "Make History Now." And so that speaks to that you can only make history now. You can't make history someday. And it comes from the decision you make today, or the possession, or this shot, or this defensive stance, or whatever the case. Like, it all comes down to this right now, this moment. So that's kind of what we do, and trying to make the history relevant is part of that inspiration that ideally makes a difference today.
It certainly did. And I know that I have a greater appreciation for being able to actually play the sport myself, and consider this your verbal blurb for the back of the book.
Hey, thank you.
Stamp from the Thunder Basketball Universe podcast. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Exactly. And Claude, thank you again for joining us and for allowing us to dive into this book with you. We really appreciate you and your time. So thank you again.
Thanks.
And if anybody wants to get the book, by the way, just go to thatnewbook.com. Thatnewbook.com.
Okay.
Easy to remember.
Amazing.
That's perfect. Yes. And this book will be on sale and available May 24th. Be sure to go check it out. We highly recommend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Paris. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Coop Ale Works is the proud sponsor of Thunder Basketball Universe. Brewers of the fan favorites F5 IPA and 99-calorie Ice Chest IPA. You'll find those and many more Coop beers at retailers across Oklahoma. Learn more at coopaleworks.com.
What an incredible interview and so much great information. Once again, me and Gallo cannot recommend this book enough. I feel like personally it should be just given basketball 101 history if you're planning on playing the sport.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we think about the starting of this game, Naismith inventing the game, the YMCA culture. Yeah. And then, for some reason, the way that it's taught is this sort of just this fast forwarding of the game up until the NBA comes about. And this really helps provide a fuller picture, especially, you think about the players here at the Thunder, the players in the NBA. And for these guys, these are their basketball ancestors and the people that persevered and pushed forward when the game was only for white people at that time.
Right.
So it's just great to bring some of this full circle, and so awesome to learn more about that connection that was forged between Claude and Sam and the Thunder organization.
I have an all new appreciation for this sport, and also there's another hidden layer of inspiration after talking to Claude, learning that he got D's in high school in English and has now put out a nearly 500-page narrative nonfiction book about the history of basketball. That's inspiration if I've ever seen it.
And one thing, if you are super into basketball, I assume that's why you're listening to this podcast, but if you're into history as well, there are so many fascinating subplots, and the ways that these lives of these figures just interwove with some of these historical events are going to be so fascinating. I learned a lot about just the way that things were in the early 1900s, late 1800s that I didn't know about. And you're going to see names like Carnegie and Rockefeller and some of these massive historic events that I got a little bit of a deeper appreciation for in terms of just what actually happened in the history. So I think it's sort of an all-encompassing read.
Needless to say, a lot to learn from this book. We highly recommend it. The TBU crew highly recommends it. And you can find it, like Claude said, on thatnewbook.com. And for today, thank you so much for listening. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much to our producer, Matt Bishop. And until next time, Thunder up and catch you later.